Now I will request the chair and the speakers for the final session to kindly take their respective seats as we begin the proceedings for the session on women, peace and security beyond the battlefield. The chair for this session is Ms. Rita Manchanda, former Executive Director, South Asia Forum of Human Rights, New Delhi. The speakers are Dr. Reena Kashyap, Associate Professor, Delhi University, New Delhi. We have with us Lieutenant Colonel Suman Gawani, former UN Miss Peacekeeper, New Delhi. Dr. Shweta Singh, Associate Professor, South Asian University, New Delhi. The chair will get 5 minutes each to make opening and closing remarks. The speakers will get 15 minutes each to make their presentations. This will be followed by a 15 minutes question and answer round moderated by the chair. I request the chair to kindly take the proceedings forward.
Welcome back from lunch. The last session of a fairly intensive program is always a challenge, but I hope that we will be able to inspire you to engage with us. The Women, Peace and Security agenda is what we're going to be focusing on today. And in a sense, it's a commemorative moment, 25 years since the path-breaking UN Security Council Resolution 2000 was passed. It was passed in 2000. But I want to just take my 5 minutes to just frame it a little bit, and which is that this was a pretty, it was an extraordinary resolution. Extraordinary in the sense that it was mobilized. It's one of the few UN platform interventions, initiatives where civil society actually was the motivating force. It was this huge mobilization of women's collectives, transnational collectives, international collectives, global South collectives, South Asian collectives that actually moved the agenda forward. The agenda which was flagged at the Beijing conference, as well as at the Nairobi conference in 1985, and then again 1995 in the Beijing conference. But this was a whole new order. Joining the women's collectives were femocrats. Femocrats are feminist bureaucrats, feminist scholars. And feminist scholars were, of course, part of the women's collectives, as well as independent in terms of providing the intellectual framing for the agenda. And, of course, there were sympathetic representatives of states. Anwar Lal Chaudhry, the Bangladesh ambassador, who happened to be at that point of time the president of the UN Security Council. And there was a lot of debate about whether to locate it, where to locate it, because many, particularly women from the global South, felt that the UN Security Council, after all, what does it represent? It represents an unfair balance of power in terms of the international order. Also, it is a neo-colonial, the people or the states peopling it are have often followed neo-colonial imperialist agendas. So there was a lot of skepticism about locating it there. But I'm afraid that the drive from the feminist majority, women waging peace, was very, very strong. They said the only way we're going to be taken seriously is if we locate it in the big boys group. And the big boys group was, of course, the Security Council. Locating it in the Security Council has meant that, in a sense, it's an orphan, because states may or may not acknowledge and drive it. Civil society is now only around the table. It's not at that table. And one of the problems has been that the implementation, therefore, is state-driven. And states at points in time, there are more than 109, I think there are 111 states that have adopted the major implementing platform for the Women, Peace and Security agenda, which is the National Action Plan. Now, the National Action Plan is a state plan. Sure, civil society groups like in Nepal have been very instrumental in shaping it, but the funding comes from the state. And if the state loses interest, withdraws the funding, it's a dead letter. And unfortunately, that has happened. Then there is, of course, the whole issue of very few states willing to accept that they have conflicts, internal conflicts. We have law and order situations, and in India, Pakistan, Bangladesh, we say we have law and order situations. We do not have conflicts. However, we do embrace the women, peace, and security agenda, and that is looking outside, meaning external orientation. And I'm delighted that today we have with us Colonel Gavani, because India has interpreted the women, peace, and security agenda, particularly in terms of its engagement in peacekeeping, that is, gender integration in UN peacekeeping, or even multilateral peacekeeping. I know that we have very, very distinguished panelists here who know the issue like the back of their hand, but let me just say that one of the problems has been that there were these 4 pillars: protection, prevention, participation, and relief, or rather rebuilding, relief and rebuilding of societies. Unfortunately, partly because it was state-driven and there was a very large global north presence, it was convenient to focus on the protection issue. The protection issue then got narrowed into sexual violence. And, I can't resist sharing this rather spicy footnote, which is that, as I said, this is a commemorative moment at the UN. In fact, 2 days ago at the UN Women's Executive Director spoke about WPS. In the UN Security Council, several members, including Pakistan and India, spoke of the WPS agenda. WPS agenda, very, very, very concisely, the gender differentiated impact of conflict on women and men and other sexualities, as well as the whole issue of the participation and the importance of the participation of women for sustainable peace building. So at the UN Security Council, you had Pakistan speaking first, and Pakistan spoke about the violence perpetrated by Indian forces in Kashmir, sexualized violence perpetrated by the Indian forces in Kashmir. The riposte came by India, which was Pakistan, when East Pakistan existed before it became Bangladesh in 1971, when there was this Operation Searchlight. The figure quoted is that 400,000 women were Bengali women were raped. Now you can see this. This is this usual baiting that goes on, unfortunately, between India and Pakistan in international fora. But what is more interesting about it is they're both referring to internal conflicts which they do not recognize as at all relevant to the women, peace, and security agenda. Of course, India did affirm, as it rightly should, that it has been a pioneer in gender integration in UN peacekeeping, and it is totally committed to the women, peace, and security agenda. I think I've exhausted my 5 minutes, so let me first turn my attention, the person on my right, Professor Reena who is a friend as well as someone who I know as the guest editor of the most recent issue of India Quarterly, which is focused entirely on women, peace, and security. She shares some of the skepticism that has been voiced at the UN, as I said, by the UN Women Director, which is the survival of the WPS agenda at a moment when it is an era of wars, when military spending is surging, when and the whole gender agenda is being pushed back. So at this point of time, can we really talk about gender equality, gender empowerment in the context of women, peace, and security? Where does the optimism lie? Because she says she's an eternal optimist. Hard to find perhaps too many silver linings in this very grim scenario. But to you.
Thank you. Can you all hear me? Yeah. Thank you, Rita, for setting the context, resetting the context, and making our task easier. My commendations to ICWA for what I believe were provocative, enriching sessions yesterday and today. I managed to catch a bit in the early afternoon, but I missed the sessions yesterday. However, I am segueing into the session seamlessly, I think, via another route. As Rita just mentioned, I was the guest editor of ICWA's journal India Quarterly, special issue on WPS. I believe that we got a record number of submissions, which itself is a testimony to the traction that WPS continues to have. I believe the submissions were from all over the world. We were particularly happy to have several from Africa, which unfortunately we could not include, but very interesting insights there. This enthusiasm was a good place to begin with. So therefore, when you say my note of optimism comes from the fact that this particular issue, despite all the misgivings, continues to enjoy that traction. And there were several voices that we managed to include. So what I will do right now is that in the first part of my 15 minutes, what I'll do is talk about some of the insights we got from this particular issue, the various articles, because these articles were written by scholars from both the global north and global south. This included experts, but it also included young scholars. And what you see is the expansion of each term of WPS agenda, women, peace, and security. All these three terms got problematized. And so they were conceptually unpacked. And while there were disappointments expressed about its shrinkage in terms of state, nation state, modern nation state, and international organizations' practices of reducing it to cosmetics, there were also articles which, even in their critical lens, were taking cues from the WPS advocates who remind us, as the title of this session does, that WPS goes beyond the battlefield. And when you expand the domain of the three concepts, women, peace, and security. So before I share these insights, I will talk a bit about why I regard the battlefield as a spectrum. And if we have more time, I'll come back to this again in the end. My argument comes from my engagement with issues of security as being in an intimate relationship with development. So my lens is that of the political economy of security and development. I use this to explore the terrain of women's insecurity and quest for peace. Foucault's appending of Clausewitz's dictum that we have heard several times today in in the hall, at least I heard it once, I assume it would have been said earlier too, war is the pursuit of politics by other means. So what Foucault proposes instead is that what if politics is the pursuit of war by other means? So what this demonstrates to us is that the land beyond the battlefield is a chimera, meaning that war is the normal, and that's what continues. Now, that is in our times. War is a norm that takes place in two avatars. Number one, the formal war, where violence is physical and overt. And second, the informal war that rages for women in the everyday encounters of structural violence. The feminist slogan, the personal is the political, underlined this quotidian nature of war that women experience even in peace times, long after the guns have gone silent. So, women's movements and feminist scholarship are premised on this recognition of war as a spectrum. More on this later if we have time. So, the sense that we get from the range of voices in the special issue of WPS is that the terrain of WPS, these are audacious voices in their criticism and equally bold in their optimism. None of them are willing up to give up on 1325. So, the WPS is dead. Long live WPS. In the conceptual unpacking is in the articles is a recognition that WPS has given us a new grammar of politics, that the state and IOs, that is international organizations, have no choice but to recognize, even if only for a lip service. Yes, mainstreaming comes with its potential traps of co-option and appropriation. In my interviews, all three, Cynthia Enloe, Meenakshi Gopinath, and Madhu Bhalla, recognize how significant it was for women to claim the language of power via that of security and walk the tightrope where a misstep drags you right into the abyss of securitization. Similarly, John Mulakatu, in his paper on the Democratic Republic of Congo, highlighted this very problem in the neologism security, sexurity, sexurity, that is the coming together of these two words, sex and security, and how rape has got securitized. And securitization of rape on one hand did give it the attention it deserved of international organizations, but at the same time it also led to the victims, the survivors' voices being marginalized. So that's the paradox we walk when we politicize the term, but we have no option but to come out into the politics. So the attempt by WPS advocates has been to append the language of power, that you appropriate that language of power not to become like that, but in order to change that, transform that. So finding articulations beyond traditional deterrence vocabularies, traditional security dilemmas, mutually hurting stalemate positions, or even techno-strategic discourse. We need to find a common ground where recognizing differences, rebuilding trust, rather than the language of power brokerage is resorted to. So that was one sense that we got from the various voices. Second, most of them also pointed out the difficulty of operating within the realm of real politics, of the international, where national interests balk the citizen scholar and turn a blind eye to the precarity that informs women's lives. Therefore, the working across geographies, the conference's theme, where similar differences and different similarities mark the experience of women. Now, these experiences were not just about survivorhood, but the archiving for inspiration, that the intervention that women have made, both in the philosophical articulations and practices by women of WPS before UNSCR 1325. That is, these scholars, particularly those in the interview, they underline the fact that there are indigenous voices which were talking about issues about women, peace, and security in very radical ways, even before these terms were invented. So I think archiving that, and that archiving is important, as I say, because it tells us about possibilities. It gives us it shows it makes it possible for us to make a roadmap. They are inspiring, to say the least. Now, to recall these interventions is to salvage them from the dustbin of forgotten history. And this is imperative as it makes possible the audacity of hope. Now, it's what is also significant. Another particular point that Rita has talked about, and which the earlier session was also very clearly talking about, is that we are trying to deal with women's security, women's needs, but what about the context of the structural impediments to their security, to their needs? Now, in that particular context, we do know that things don't happen overnight. So a lot of what happens in war gets justified, gets legitimized, or is normalized. If not legitimized, is normalized, that ye to hota hi hai. This happens in war because there are things happening in our domestic, the inside outside, the perennial problem of the international. So that so unless there are changes that take place in the domestic, it's very difficult to upscale them. But we can't wait. So it becomes a chicken egg situation. So most of the articles also therefore emphasize the simultaneity of efforts which need to be made. And as we talk about, just 6 days ago, we have the first female appointed as the Archbishop of Canterbury. 1,400 years of, history of the Anglican Church. This has happened for the first time. So you celebrate that. As we celebrate that, what we also need to remember is it was possible in this particular church because this is a church which just a few years ago had recognized same-sex marriage. This is a church which had underlined that which had admitted women as bishops. But this is a big step nevertheless. 2 minutes. What I also want to sort of, then there were other articles which drew attention. When they stretch the meaning of security, they identify new forms of insecurity, some of which are already there in the themes of the conference: climate, digital insecurity, and the kind of violence women experience in the digital age being very different. So those were insights. So I would suggest that you have a look at this particular special issue. And what else? Yes, if I can just go back to so what I will do is I'll skip this particular part and talk about that why is it that I think the Foucauldian lens of governmentality, biopolitics becomes important over here. When I say when I refer to the Foucauldian appending of Clausewitz's dictum, the modern state is seeking to ensure prosperity of the citizen. That's where you get the legitimacy of the state. But at the same time, simultaneously, what is happening is that there is what Foucault describes as the politics of death, thanatopolitics. And you see that exactly happening in Gaza. So Gaza, what you're doing, one form of the genocide is to attack the reproductive capacity of the Palestinian women. So once again, what we see is a return to the fact that women's wombs continue to be the site to be defiled, to be honored, but it's a battlefield nevertheless. A battlefield in which you save the honor, but you also defile that very body. And yeah, so okay, I'll stop here and take the questions later. Yeah, okay. So no, maybe. So just give me half a second. Let me just end on a more positive note. Sarah Molale, who's become the first Archbishop of Canterbury, she said in her first public address, she said, if you want to walk fast, I mean, this is a quote we have heard, but the fact that she reiterated that in her first public address, that if you want to walk fast, then you walk alone. But if you want to go far, you walk together. And I think the earlier session mentioned about men being allies. And therefore, I think the WPS agenda, a point again in the journal, which we make, is that what we have forgotten or what we have not emphasized enough is the aspect about gender. It's it is, talking about males, females, men, women. The problem being masculinity, the problem being femininity. That is these two as problems. Okay.
Thank you very much, and I'm sorry to make you close like so abruptly. But I hope the issue of India Quarterly is outside and available for us to see. The other thing is, now you reminded me of, in fact, the subclause of this session, which is beyond the battlefield. In a sense, I think the direction WPS is taking, that is the Women, Peace and Security agenda is taking, other than, of course, the protection agenda, is in fact the militarist agenda. We are going back to the battlefield. But this time we are taking women with us into the battlefield, into uniforms, and the soldierly woman is becoming foregrounded in the Women, Peace and Security agenda. A clause, a very worrying clause that has been articulated by feminists, by practitioners, has been making war safe for women, reducing sexual violence, providing more compassionate care for women, more humanitarian care for women, but in the context of war, and embracing the entry, the gender integration of our armies. I'm very glad that, in fact, Colonel Gavani is with us. She, as I think was mentioned, she won in 2019 the Gender Advocate Award of the UN. She was a military observer in the Sudan, in the UN mission there. Not only was she herself a military observer, but she was a major then, but she also, because of her success in outreach, her success in being able to win the trust of the local population, or the women at least, and I think the men, she also was involved in the training of military in the military patrols and military observers, and in fact made a point, or was actually celebrated for her attempts to integrate the gender lens in UN peacekeeping. However, there's been a lot of controversy, and I hope you take this on, that women are providing the emotional labor, whereas the men are providing the muscular protective or they're playing the muscular protective role. And this is, in a sense, a reproduction of gender essentialized roles. This is not a transformation of gendered roles. And not only is it a transformation of peacekeeping, that it's still being seen in a very militarist form, rather than the valuation of care and compassion at the same level of military protection.
Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. I, Lieutenant Colonel Suman Gavani, from the Indian Army, standing here in front of you. So, I would be presenting my views about women, peace and security. So, to be honest, standing here in front of all of you on this stage, in a room full of knowledge, insights, I literally feel overwhelmed. And I must admit that this is more intimidating than any task that I have done on the field, literally. So, to say the chaos here is more orderly, the danger here feels more theoretical. So, on the field, it's a constant noise. There's a lot of uncertainty what will go on, and I think that was more easier than to talk here about all that. So with this, I would just begin whatever I have to talk about. As we all say and know that a picture speaks more than 1,000 words. This picture, as we see, presents a great contrast between the intimate and tender act of a mother feeding her child and the harsh and chaotic environment of a crisis. So we cannot see the crisis here, but by the virtue of a UN vehicle, a patrol vehicle standing there, we know that this is a crisis location. This mother's act is an unwavering dedication to the spirit of survival, despite the dire situations in her own country. This photograph was one of the first photographs that I had taken when I was out on a patrol in a village in South Sudan. So we had parked our vehicles, we had gone to the nearby villages. We saw this lady with her child and her younger sister walking by. So all that you can see are their belongings in those 2-3 bags that they carry. They were running away from a conflict that happened, that engulfed their village. They were not aware where the men of their family are. So it was a life and death situation for them. Seeing all of us in the patrol, and I was the only woman in that patrol, they were not stopping. I was inside the vehicle. By then, I had not moved out. So the men were asking them, and it's very difficult to differentiate between the people in uniform who had caused that harm to you and your people, and the people in uniform who are asking, where are you going? Because even in South Sudan, even the people who wear uniform, who are from police and military, are causing grievous harm to, I will not say only women and girls, to even young boys and men. So differentiating in the uniform for these people is very, very difficult. But yes, of course, when I got down from the vehicle, they were more willing to talk. Maybe they saw a ray of hope in me, or in my uniform, or probably in the flag that I was wearing on my chest. So this was one of the first pictures, and I took it as a background for my work, because this inspired me to do more for these people. And here on, I took the challenge that whatever we can do, whatever I can do in my capacity as a peacekeeper, as a military observer, I would do. Here on, I faced the challenge that I could not speak their language. Most of them in the rural settings speak Arabic. In the urban settings, in the capital city, they speak English, of course, but in rural settings, they speak Arabic and their indigenous languages. So I took upon this challenge to learn a little bit of Arabic, because of course the language breaks barriers. And I took an online course, and it helped me a lot. It helped me a lot to break the barriers, not only with the women, with men as well. So in next few patrols, when we could, just by greeting them in their language, it made a difference. A lot of difference in our dealings with them, a lot of difference in the outcome of our patrols in the villages or in the urban settings. So moving forward, all of us know the foundation, the origin, and the core goal of United Nations Security Council Resolution 1325. It was the first time that the world realized that women are not only the victims, but they are also indispensable actors in peace building, peacekeeping, preventing violence. Post 1325, there were more resolutions that came up, and this acknowledges that the entire world needs peace. They acknowledge the experiences, perception, and leadership of women are crucial for peacekeeping and peace building. All of us know the 4 strong pillars of the women, peace, and security, so I will not dwell more upon it. Post 1325, there were 3 more Security Council resolutions that need our attention. The resolution 1820, which called for, which focused specifically on conflict-related sexual violence. So I have done a course in Kenya on conflict-related sexual violence. It was a month-long course. And I was surprised to see that half of the participants of this course, one woman belonged to the Kenyan military. She was herself a survivor of conflict-related sexual violence. She narrated her story, and she had been raped 8 times. First by the tribals. When she went on to report to the police station, the police constable raped her, the police officer raped her. When it was reported to the community elders raped her, and the chain went on for 8 times. So, yes, before she joined, yes, of course. So later the reforms in the community and through multiple NGOs, she joined the military later. She was a soldier in the Kenyan military. I will also speak about South Sudan because I have been there and I have seen it up close. In South Sudan, there are indigenous tribes, and the battle, I would say, is more of power. Who holds the power? Which tribe holds the power? The Nuer and Dinka tribes being the largest tribes. So both of them want that the president be from their tribe. And most of the conflict-related sexual violences happen between these 2 tribes. So men from one tribe would go on hunt where the other tribe lives. The men have been out, of course, for a living, and women are alone there. They would rape the women, abduct children. And the chain goes on. So the Nuers inflict on the Dinkas, and the Dinkas inflict on the Nuers. So this resolution was very, very important, I think, because on the field, it actually happens. So the warring sections are using rape, sexual violence as a weapon of war. Then secondly, the next resolution is 1888. So this emphasizes on the importance of leadership and accountability in addressing sexual violence. Now, leadership and accountability, again, an experience. So I would admit that I would be talking more from my own experiences when I was deployed in the mission, because I do not have any academic knowledge on the subject. All that knowledge I have gained is over a course of my deployment and coming back from the deployment, of course. So the Security Council Resolution 1888 emphasizes on the roles of leadership. So based on this resolution, we were training the South Sudanese forces on gender sensitivities, gender equalities, and all these things that we talk about. To my surprise, I was training the class full of 40 senior military officers of South Sudan. Most of them were generals, brigadiers, colonels, not below colonels anyone. So they were 40 in that their army headquarters. So when we touched upon the topic of rape, so one of the generals speaks and says, she's ought to be raped because she doesn't listen to me. So how else can I make her listen to me? So this was the situation of the officials in a security force. Those who are wearing uniform and are meant to protect those women. And that's their thinking. And he was not the only one. He was echoing the sentiments of most of his male colleagues, most of his male counterparts in other government agencies that we had interacted with. The next the next resolution 2467 introduced survivor-centered initiatives and comprehensive support mechanism. So till now we were only talking about women and girls. We were talking about that women are the victims, but thankfully this resolution increased its attention to specific needs of male survivors. Because in a conflict, there are not only women who are victims or survivors, there are males as well. And we came across some of them. Some of the boys who were in the detention camps were being raped, were being sexually assaulted. So till now, nobody was listening to them, because of course it's a cultural stigma in a closed society like Africa, or even in any of our societies, even in India. It's a cultural stigma that a boy says that he has been raped. So this resolution talks about it, and we did address a little bit of it, not so much. Now, the chair had already covered half of what I wanted to cover about the critiques of Security Council resolution. This resolution is firstly problematic in its representation. It offers a maternalist discourse and has intersectional failures. I would say problematic representation because it always addresses women as victims. Why should we address women as victims always? They are not the victims always. It also has a maternalist discourse to say that it says that women have natural instinct of being peaceful and protective. When we say that gender is not by birth and gender is malleable, how can we say that women are more peaceful? They become so from their experiences and from their societies. But by birth, we cannot say that a woman is more peaceful. So it reinforces or portrays women naturally as peaceful, and that should not happen. And thirdly, it views gender solely as women issue, which should not be there, because by doing that, we are excluding half of the society from these processes. We are excluding men, and men who should go hand in hand with us, who often go hand in hand with us, but in societies which are driven by conflicts, it's not happening. So the intersectional failures exist. Now, when we say about the problematic representation, this Security Council resolution says that peace processes that have women will have more chances of survival. Yes, the data says so, but what if it fails? The data says that yes, it will have more chances of survival, but what if a peace process that had women in it fails? Are we not putting a burden of expectation on the women? If it fails, then next time when a peace process happens, men will say that in that so and so process, women were there. What happened? It failed. So I think we should rather see women as equal partners in the society, rather than finding ways why should they be in a peace process. They are a part of society. They form half of the society, so they should be a part of it, and they should form in a decision-making body that affects their society. 2 minutes, I'll have to close right now. Fine. Then most of it, the chair had already concluded that the concept, this resolution is silent on militarization. It maintains the status quo, and the security concept is really, really narrow. Indian context also had been taken over by the chair, but I would come to this that India was the first country that deployed an all-women police contingent to UN mission in Liberia. And the impact of it has been well known. It made a security sector reform after that. Almost 25% of the girls knew about the new opportunities. Almost 25% of the girls wanted to join the police forces and now form a part of the Liberian police forces, right? The in India's internal challenges, persistent gaps are there. So, like we said, that in Jammu and Kashmir, the internal violence and Pakistan claimed that sexual violence and harm inflicted on the women in JNK. I have been in JNK for almost six and a half years, and with conviction, I can say that there is nothing like that happening there, right? So when we say that women's representation in military policy and political leadership has reduced, so there is a ray of hope, and I will talk with numbers that in the IAS batch that passed out in 2023, out of the 180 bureaucrats that passed out from the academy, 74 were women. That makes a huge 41% of the entire batch. So I think as a country we are catching up. There's a lot to catch up, but yes, we are catching up. So coming on to the conclusion, as women, Swami Vivekananda once said, and I quote, "Educate your women first and leave them to themselves. They will tell you what reforms are necessary for them," unquote. These are just the numbers, and I'm sure most of us are aware about it. The success stories, there is a Haiti justice innovation that has happened. So all the judges in the Haiti have formed a justice innovation, and Haitian Association of Women Judges. So they are promoting gender equality, they are promoting women's rights. Then Mali, there is a peace hut network in Mali. So this first hut was formed in 2013. This is an excellent example of how grassroots level workers affect, and of course the global peacekeeping and inclusion of women in the peacekeeping forces. So to conclude, I would say that 25 years is an excellent time to look back and see what progress we have made. And as said, that peace is not merely the absence of war, but the presence of justice, equality, and women's voices at every table where decisions about our shared future are made. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much for sharing so frankly with us your experience. I'm sure there will be many questions and perhaps contestations as well. You know, so many peace agreements fall. Most of those peace agreements have been negotiated by men. Do we then say men shouldn't be at that table? So I'm not sure that I buy your argument, and I think there will be other issues that will be taken up, but thank you so much for sharing. I will now turn to the last speaker, and not the least, and that is Professor Shweta Singh. I hope that you will take on some of the issues of the localization of the WPS agenda. These are global, even hegemonic norms. As somebody said, I think, as Reena said earlier, that they have enormous influence on our governments, whether it is at the level of rhetoric or whether at the level of practice and policy, but certainly at the level of rhetoric. What are the challenges, or what is the relevance of localization of these agenda? And perhaps you could take up the issue that Colonel raised, which was about the whole issue of participation and of the women's collectives or local groups, not only at the state level, and does the state even recognize them? My own experience is the state ignores them.
Thank you, Rita. Thank you. I think it's very rare to be on a panel with activists, academics, and practitioners. So thank you, ICWA, for bringing us all together. Thank you, Ms. Nutan Mahavar, Dr. Nivedita Ray, and Avni, for really foregrounding these conversations at the center stage of the imaginary called the political. And I think this is a huge step forward as we are having this conversation on the 25th year
as we celebrate the WPS agenda. The challenges, the impediments, but the language of engagement that it has given us. And I think that we are all on the same page in the context of the language that it has given us to engage with. So where do I start? And what is the story that I want to tell you? And Rita, I take your clue on the context of localization and maybe bring in the story on the everyday. Now, I want to take I would say my call in this paper or in this brief presentation is actually threefold. The first is to highlight the gaps in the WPS research agenda, and I come in as an academic, as a critical feminist scholar, which has been broadly global in its dimension. And I want to stress the word global. Now, when we say global in its orientation, most research, and we would really look at this research emanating from the global north, has been focused on ideas of norms diffusion or norms translation or norms constitution as part of this normative agenda. And they're based on a particular category of linearity. So norms translate from the global to the national to the local. So there is this kind of linearity that is being emphasized on. In the process, the everyday or the local is bereft of its agency. The second is that which I want you to, I want to gently nudge you is to think about, and where am I foregrounding this conversation? I'm foregrounding this conversation in the context of Afghanistan. Now, I want to gently nudge you. We've been thinking about Africa, we've been thinking about Sudan, but why do you think the Afghan woman has been invisibilized? And what is the connected politics of epistemic silence surrounding academic scholarship, when we are looking at women from Afghanistan? The third is, I call your attention to recenter your gaze on the everyday. And that's really the conceptual hook. And when I'm talking about the everyday, I'm again not talking about the everyday in the context of a scalar orientation. When I say a scalar orientation, in the context of international, national, or local, but I want you to think about the everyday in the context of densification of politics. And I think that's extremely important. And here, when we are thinking about participation, I think we need to move away from just the agential capacity of women to act, but also to think about acts of resistance as agency and acts of resistance as participation. And I think that's where the Afghan woman who's been caricatured as a victim needs to be problematized. So just to briefly walk you through the existing academic scholarship, and as I said, that emanates mostly from the global north, has been to look at this global dimension. Now, the case of Afghanistan is extremely interesting. We often talk about Afghanistan, but it's a very interesting site for analysis from the standpoint of the women, peace, and security agenda and the question of women's agency. But if you look at the scholarship on Afghanistan, it's extremely important. I would nudge you to look at the scholarship on Afghanistan. More specifically, women's agency is caricatured, or the Afghan women is caricatured as a victim whose voice is subsumed by social, cultural, and gender norms. So, the Afghan woman is caricatured, discursively construed as someone who does not have a voice within the context of the gender complex that we are talking about. Very little attention, except a few scholars who've been working on it, actually pays attention to the complex dynamics of gender relations in Afghanistan. And Afghanistan is a very interesting context in that context. So while it is important to recognize that women in Afghanistan have had limited voice of participation in high-level state building and peace processes, despite the advent of the WPS agenda and the gender-specific impact of conflict, including their experiences of extreme forms of gender-based violence, nevertheless, and I really emphasize this, it is equally important to underline that women also deploy the WPS agenda to construe the agency and resistance differently. In fact, the language of WPS agenda has been construed to reclaim their agency and negotiate within the patriarchal norms that we are talking about. but they do not necessarily speak to the liberal script that we are talking about, you know, the liberal script of agency that we are foregrounding. Now, in that context, for instance, what do I do today? And this is based on the context of a brief field work that I had in the context of Afghanistan, and my continuing work on Afghanistan is to look at the Afghan Peace and Reintegration Program. And as part of the Afghan Peace and Reintegration Program, there was the provincial peace committees, and women's participation in the provincial peace committees is an important site for analysis. Now, much scholarship on the WPS agenda, as I said, is trapped in what is called a one-size-fits-all analytical framework. And I was very, I was very intrigued, and I was also very happy to see how the title of this conference said from differing geographies, from across geographies, because context is important, situated knowledge is important, and foregrounding that through an epistemic lens becomes extremely important. So I would say, know what politics must be, because I think in that one-size-fit agenda, we tend to reify frames of politics, or we tend to look at the similar kinds of sites for engagement. But my question is, how do you start to visibilize sites of politics which are often invisibilized in the family and community spaces in a patriarchal setup like Afghanistan? What is the language that you engage with? How do you engage with ideas of agency and resistance in a highly patriarchal setup like Afghanistan? And I think this is where attention to quotidian practices, to the little nothings, becomes important. These little nothings or these quotidian practices within the family and the community setup might not be phenomenal from the liberal script of agency that we are talking about, but what they are foregrounding is ideas of chipped resistance. And I think these ideas of chipped resistance or quotidian practices helps us to understand the template of participation within, beyond, above and below the liberal script of the WPS agenda. And I think there's been interesting scholarship on this context. And in that context, I think I draw on the work of Gilliman and Huseman to define the everyday. And I want to take a second to quote this definition of everyday. This is not restrictive or proscriptive within the context of levels of analysis, just as the state, individual, or the international system, but rather a fluid site of activity densely populated with actors, objects, and practices. So in my earlier work, which was published in the IFJP, I looked at the impediments within the context of everyday. And the work that I'm developing right now is I'm looking at the ideas of resistance within the context of everyday. Now, if you look at Afghanistan and the everyday for women in Afghanistan, what is the everyday for women in Afghanistan? Away from the scalar levels of local or the state or the national, the everyday, the woman is traversing within the family, the community, the tribal structures, the arbakai, and also differing kinds of frameworks. So there is the Sharia law, there is also the customary practices like Pashtunwali. And within the context, there is a tendency to frame this as inhibiting the agency of women. But are there spaces and sites within this context that we can engage with? Now, if I can say that some of the limited scholarship that exists tends to look at these spaces that inhibit women's agency. But I would say, if you deploy this analytical framework of the everyday and focus on the densification of politics, then you can really look at how norms are translated locally. How is it that women actually translate these norms, for instance, as members of the PPC, the provincial peace committees that I'm talking about? How is it that, when in their work in the context of talking to insurgent families, they deploy their identities of being a wife or a mother or being a sister? And how is it that they're engaging with these traditional customary practices like the Pashtunwali law and the conflict resolution mechanisms that exist within that? So I would say the challenge then is that pay attention to, and I think that's the epistemic rupture that we are talking about, pay attention to these little nothings as political. These acts of little nothings as political. And these little nothings in the everyday, I think, remain understudied. Now, just a bit of backdrop, just to set some of these examples, and I'm just looking at the time, just a bit of backdrop in the context of the Afghan Peace and Reintegration Program. As part of the National Consultative Peace Jirga, it was held in the year 2010, and it established a nationwide network for inclusive peace, which included, among other objectives, reintegration of ex-combatants, particularly the Taliban. Now, we all know the policy in the context of the gender apartheid and women's engagement now as part of the PPCs to engage with the Taliban. Now, the National Jirga resulted in the creation of the Afghanistan Peace and Reintegration Program and the High Peace Council. And the HPC, the High Peace Council, was a 70-member body which included 9 women. Now, and it had, the provincial peace committees across the 32 provinces. Most PPCs, I'm talking about the 32 provinces across Afghanistan, most PPCs had around 2 to 3 women members. Now, the Afghan Peace and Reintegration Program and the composition of the PPC needs to be read against the significant backdrop of normative frameworks like the United Nations Security Council Resolution 1325 and Article 22 of the Constitution, Article 22 of the Constitution, where all Afghan citizens, both in men and women, have equal rights. So I won't get into the context of the PPC and the Afghan Peace and Reintegration Program, but just to walk you through that as part of the PPCs, women, as I said, had a role to engage with the insurgents. And Wasma Frog, who's written extensively and an activist in the field, says that in the context of outreach to the insurgents and to encourage them lay their arms, women played a very important role. And they blurred these traditional boundaries of the family, the community, the tribal systems that we are talking about. And many of the times, in fact, there's another interesting study which reiterates that, and I know Rita is doing interesting work around that too. But one of the studies that empirically looks at some of these strategies was the Afghanistan Research and Evaluation Unit study, titled Women's Participation in the Afghan Peace Process by Shukriya Azamdesh and Isafullah Ghaffori, who actually highlight these subtle strategies of negotiations that women were engaging. So what were these subtle strategies of negotiations within the legal frameworks or the contesting legal frameworks that I'm talking about? When I say contesting legal frameworks, please remember there's the Afghanistan, the Constitution in Afghanistan. There are the global normative frameworks. Afghanistan had, interestingly, a national action plan. Then there is the customary law, the Pashtunwali law, and then there is the Sharia law. So the women in the everyday spaces is actually navigating these contesting pieces of frameworks. Now, what is interesting is that within the context of customary law in Afghanistan, there is also the whole context of traditional conflict resolution mechanisms like Nanavati. Within the context of the Pashtunwali code that we are talking about, where the whole family of a person accused repents and asks for forgiveness. Now, it's very interesting when you talk to the PPC members or when you engage with many women who've been working on the field, they actually talk about while men are reticent to talk to women, when they identify themselves as a mother or as a wife or as a sister and engage with them using these traditional modes of engagement, there is an openness and trust that is initiated. And as I said, this is within the patriarchal setup that we are talking about. But what my departure point is, within the liberal script, we cannot dismiss this as patriarchal bargain. There is a language of engagement in the context of agency and participation that we need to script and understand, which is very unique in the context of differing geographies. And I think South Asia is important in that context. So for instance, I'm just going to close. Just on that note, if I can say that I think the challenge then is spaces like this becomes an act of epistemic rupture. I think for us to foreground this conversation is also to visibilize what has been invisibilized, So as part of academic scholarship, as part of most of the writings happening on Afghanistan, Rita talked about the whole context of neocolonial imperialist politics. I think we need to foreground the visibility that has been on the margins in the context of the Afghan woman. Thank you.
that the Afghanistan you're talking about is, of course, before the advent or the ascendancy of the Taliban too, or the new Islamic Emirate that is in power in Afghanistan. It's interesting that the National Action Plan of Afghanistan, which was a very much a top-down plan, is barely mentioned by Shweta, and because it shows how irrelevant it was, and how much more her engagement has been with the framework of everyday politics, the densification of everyday forms of resistance and agency. It's I just want to mention one thing. I've been involved in a huge report on Afghanistan Today, and what surprised us were the continuing levels of quiet resistance that is taking place in Afghanistan, largely amongst the women, because they're the ones who are, after all, the most caged. It's open now to questions, comments, observations. If you're making observations and comments, please try and be brief, and make your questions can be addressed to anyone. Yes, please.
Thank you very much. My name is Laura Yerkesheva. I'm from Kazakhstan.
Oh, yeah.
And my, maybe not questions, but perhaps a proposal is to Lieutenant Colonel Gavani. Thank you very much for your presentation. I was very much impressed by it. I'm from Kazakhstan, and Kazakhstan became a part of peacekeeping forces together with India a few years ago. And under the Indian wing, we are also participating, our peacekeeping forces in Middle East and West Asia. And particularly, I was impressed the way how you handle and you make input of women agency into this very, difficult process. So perhaps my proposal is if you could prepare some sort of, I don't know whether to which extent you participate with the Kazakhstani forces as part of your activity, or perhaps some courses or upgrading skills on this particular element of making women agency workable, its prospects, its implications, impact, as far as for our forces, and as well through this also this could help in as a more broader output to highlight the issue of gender activity in the society of Central Asia as well. So this is like it came to me as a result of listening to you. Thank you very much.
Perhaps we could get some clarification from you. Have the multilateral forces that you have worked with, have there been any Central Asian forces?
Thank you so much for the proposal. I would be very happy if I could do that, but it needs permissions from my headquarters. So I will try and do that. Next, I did engage, I did participate with the Asian, I would say, Vietnamese, we had Chinese forces with us. I also engaged with the Kazakh forces, but not during the course of my deployment in the mission. But during a course, when I was doing this conflict-related sexual violence course in Kenya. So that was the time I could engage with them. And they were also being trained on gender sensitivity. There is a peacekeeping institute in Kenya. So there they were being trained on gender sensitivity. So and even in India, there is a Center for UN Peacekeeping, where I generally go as an instructor. I had seen 2 years back, I had seen some Kazakh officers there. So very recently, I have not been able to interact with them. But your proposal, I'll take on and try and get permissions from my headquarters. Thank you so much.
Yes, please.
Yeah, so I am Judith. So first of all, I'll take this opportunity to congratulate the panel. Very well covered all the topics. Secondly, I believe my team has reached out to all of you because we are also organizing a conference on women in diplomacy supported by ICWA. So yes, I think you have received a mail. So we will take the conversations forward. This is happening in Christ University, Delhi NCR campus. Secondly, I was just having a specific issue, as in what Rita ma'am had already talked about, the idea of how the states are actually taking issues of women who are locally talking about security and peace. So are they really considering the local agencies of women? Because what we see now is that India has actually recognized the Taliban government in Afghanistan. So how do we actually see that? And then we have the foreign minister who's actually in the UN list of who has been recognized as a terrorist, and now he is the acting foreign minister of Afghanistan, and we have the meeting with the foreign minister. So how do we as women, academicians, activists, or maybe women in the peacekeeping see this? This is very contradictory to the idea of, securing peace and human rights in the perspective of gender. Thank you.
UN Security Council, there is something called the Sanctions Committee on Terror. That's headed by Pakistan these days. I'm mentioning that not because it's Pakistan, okay? It happens to be headed by Pakistan, but all of them have to agree. And all the states have agreed that there will be a waiver for the foreign minister to travel. Otherwise, there's no way he could travel to India. So there is evidently some kind of consensus. Now, it's a global consensus that there will be levels of engagement with the Afghan leadership. There have been several UN resolutions that have also been passed talking about continuing engagement at the humanitarian level with Afghanistan. As you know, India has been engaging with Afghanistan at the humanitarian level. We have a joint technical mission there and so forth. I'm not going into soft recognition or not. That's not my brief. But what is important is that India was also amongst the first to actually condemn human rights violations by the Taliban in Afghanistan. There had always been a clause in all these statements, international statements, about condemning human rights violations, and particularly violations against women and children. It doesn't exist in the G20 declaration. So I think it just reflects that we're moving into a much more transactional world. And to single out India, I don't see much point, but everybody's behaving like this. States are behaving like this. It's up to us to be different. Yes, any other questions? Yes, please.
When we speak about the question of gender and the gender perspective in conflicts and so on, this is a kind of conundrum I've been trying to find an answer to. The thing is that there is a kind of implicit assumption that, of course, women are disproportionately affected by conflict. They are victims of various kinds of violence. They try to negotiate agency. All of that is there. But there's this implicit assumption somewhere also that women, perhaps because they have a greater stake in peace, they are naturally peaceful, will bring something of that to the table. In the past nearly 2 years, and even earlier, we have seen so many instances of women committing terrible war crimes or atrocities, whether from the time of the Second World War, if we speak of Anna Petri, or we speak of Rwanda, or we talk about Lindy England, or we more recently, if we look at the sexual violence perpetrated by women soldiers upon Palestinian men in Israel. So my question, somewhere I'm grappling with, is this, that especially when women enter very masculinized militaries, is there a pressure to conform to those patterns of militarized behavior and those power dynamics, and to prove that I may be a woman, and if that be the case, if women are as capable of atrocities, then how does the whole thing of women in peace and security, how will that navigate that?
I think, Amber, I agree with you. This is a conundrum. But where I would also say differ or foreground is that I think critical feminist scholarship is engaging with this whole question of women in militaries and the question of militarization that we are talking about. I think feminist scholarship definitely recognizes and moves beyond the essentialist construction of women as innately peaceful. Women can very much be perpetrators of violence. And the question that we are foregrounding or engaging with is the question of masculinity and femininity. So I think to subscribe and ascribe and say that a woman can perform or be ascribing to masculinity, I would also say the other way around. A man can also ascribe and be an ally and perform the feminine roles that we are talking about. But I think the larger point of engagement is the question of militarism and militarization, something that we do not foreground in our security conversations. And I think that's extremely important for us to think about, especially, again, I'm going back to the whole context of the everyday and the questions of militarism and militarization in the mundane spaces that we are talking about. And I think that's where we would get in. But I think the debate or the scholarship has moved way beyond the essentialist construction of women as nurturers or maternal care that we are talking about. So I'll leave it at that.
Dr. Amber, thank you for the question. I already agree with you, and I had presented it that we cannot construe women as naturally peaceful. At the other hand, I would say that people or states have construed their own meaning of 1325, and they say that inclusion of more women into peacekeeping or conflict resolution will solve the purpose. What we have been already doing, and even India thinks that pushing more women peacekeepers will help them side with the 1325. But at the other hand, I would also say that yes, there is a power imbalance. Yes, there is. But it is also very important for women to be seen in the conflict zone wearing uniform, because it gains the trust of the community. So, not going to South Sudan, I would refer to the case of our own country. I would talk about JNK, where I am presently posted. We have earlier there were no women soldiers, only women officers. So there was a problem in reaching to the communities because we were very few in numbers, and the interaction with the local women or men was limited. But now, since last 2 years, there are rifle women from Assam Rifles. They have been deployed in JNK. There are soldiers from BSF, soldiers from SSB. They have been deployed in JNK. So this has, to an extent, I would say that gained the trust of women. And there are a lot of initiatives that are being taken up by the soldiers, by the women officers that are in uniform. So I think it has to be balanced. Thank you.
Yeah, Amber, yes, I agree with your question, and I agree with Shweta's and Colonel Gavani's answer. And this was my question to Cynthia Enloe, if you were to go through the interview, and her response. So, adding to what Shweta and Suman have said, is that she says that, well, of course, this is what is happening around. There is this co-option, but she said we need to always remind ourselves is that women advocates who were behind WPS did not have a militaristic notion of peace and security. And these are the dangers of mainstreaming. Mainstreaming is one way in which you domesticate the issue. If you recall, Professor Randhir Singh used to say, cultural studies have domesticated Antonio Gramsci so much that now he's good enough to be taken home to your mother. So this is precisely, so it's no longer dangerous. So she says that these men are now talking the talk, but so that they don't have to walk the walk. And this was, so I'm not plagiarizing from Cynthia Enloe, I'm quoting her. That's the response.
Thank you. Let me just pick up one thread. Which is, as you said, that women who join a masculinized institution like one thread I'd like to pick out, which I do not think my colleagues here have addressed, which is that the whole issue of that when you enter, when you join, and now we are getting more and more women into the militaries all across the world, including in India. I mean, the Air Force has, I think, something like 13%, if not more. The Army is still about less than 4%, but getting there. Okay. But anyway, not to get distracted there. If the institutional culture is so masculinized, women then are the intruders. And how do you make a home in a place which is so inhospitable to you in terms of your acculturation, in terms of how your gender socialization has been? And one was that, you know, the whole idea that if you have 33%, then there can be an impact on the culture. Now we know that that perhaps is not necessarily empirically demonstrable. But the fact is that we do not know of any real transformation. I was looking at the British military. You know, they still haven't been able to get proper uniforms. I mean, you know, protective gear for women yet. It just doesn't fit them. They've not been. So it just shows you how ill at ease women still are. And I agree with you absolutely about recasting masculinities and femininities, which then are no longer located in a biological context. Any other questions? I thought I saw a hand. I mean, all of you are very active women. I engage with many of you at lunch. So nobody quiet? Yes, please.
I thought we were running out of time. But anyways, because... Oh, should I? Yeah. No, I'll just get to the point. I was just wondering, you know, we know what the situation is on the ground, but it's more or less a kind of epistemic question. What are the problems involved for somebody like Shweta, not working just in an archive or, you know, with the text, working on ground, because these are risky areas. So does it bring in something, when you talk about it in terms of framing or theorizing, how you work around it? You talk about epistemic rupture, but what ruptures do you have to go through to get to that point is something I was wondering about.
Avni, I'll just
Ma'am,
take
one last comment and then we'll...
Okay, 30 seconds. I think positionality is a big challenge. As an Indian going to Afghanistan, you're welcomed. But when I traveled, this was 2016, and the situation was very different in Afghanistan at that point of time. But still, I could not go beyond Kabul. All right. So my engagement was still with elite Pashtun women, and I had to engage with different kinds of Afghan women's networks publication, the WPSO publications, and many of the works that are happening around to actually, you know, draw insight substantively. The situation has completely changed post 2021. We were talking about the whole context of psychological violence, and I want to just quickly take 2 seconds to talk about that. Even as researchers, there is something called secondary trauma that one goes through working in conflict situations. So there is this whole context that we are talking about. The third quick point is that can we really talk about appropriating the Afghan voice? You know, there is the insider-outsider conundrum that we are talking about in the context of research. But I think the politics is to visibilize and foreground it still at the center stage of our conversation. Thank you.
Very much. I suppose I should close.
Yes, ma'am.
And you know, sitting in the room are also several field researchers who have written books. I know Kazi is here, whose work on Kashmir is absolutely fantastic. My own experiences in the Northeast and Kashmir. So I think there are many, many people here who have that, and I'm sure you yourself have your own engagement in terms of the work that you have done, which I did hear yesterday about. But thank you so much, and thank you the panelists who've been absolutely wonderful. So.
Thank you, Chair. Thank you,
Can I just say
speakers.
one thing that please have a look at the India Quarterly, because there are a lot of questions that you may have, which I asked on your behalf to scholars who are far more distinguished than us, those 3 interviews. So, you know, I think they'll answer a whole bunch of questions which didn't get the time to be asked.
This India Quarterly publication is also available outside. So I'm in completely in awe of the entire panel, and I'm sure the audience is as well. But this brings us to the end of the conference, and we directly proceed into a brief closing session of the conference. In the meantime, can you click a picture for the entire panel, please?